Hello and welcome to Me, the Wife and Wrexham AFC, a weekly podcast and YouTube channel discussing everything Wrexham from the point of view of long-term fans and brand new fans like my wife. So sit back, put your feet up, relax and let's get stuck in.
Hello and welcome back to episode 26 of Me, the Wife and Wrexham AFC. So if you watched our last episode, we gave you a little sneak peek of our interview with Mr. Bryn Law, which was amazing. So this episode will be the full interview in its entirety. So sit back, relax and enjoy.
Right, so welcome Mr. Bryn Law to Me, the Wife and Wrexham AFC.
Yeah.
It is an absolute pleasure to have you on. Thank you very much for doing this for us. I think for us, we have quite an international audience. So for all the sort of international people who are sort of watching the podcast, if they don't know maybe who Bryn Law is, Bryn is a lifelong Wrexham fan. He was a pitchside reporter on Sky Sports and is currently the lead commentator on LUTV, which is the Leeds United TV. So I suppose before we get into all the Wrexham stuff, the first question for me is, how did the whole Leeds United thing sort of start for you?
Well, it started a long way back because I was working coming from Wrexham. I was working in Wrexham for a radio station, commercial radio station, the very, very start of my career, just out of a postgrad broadcast journalism diploma that I'd done. And my first jobs were with a company called Marcher Sound, MFM Marcher Sound, who you'll know were based in North East Wales, and broadcast to Wrexham and Chester. So my first shifts as a reporter, as a news reporter, were with them. And then I gained experience through working with them, did some football matches, some match coverage of Wrexham for them as well. But my first, having done a bit of work with the BBC in South Cumbria at their radio station there as a news reporter, my first big break was effectively to get a job with BBC Radio Leeds, and that was in 1992. And that was when Leeds United had just won what was then the Football League Championship, is now the Premier League. So the top division, they'd just become the champions in that. And so I arrived in Leeds right off the back of that success. And they wanted somebody who was trained up to be a news reporter, which I was, but also somebody who had great interest in football in particular because of the success that Leeds United had just had. And they wanted me to work in a very specific role on their breakfast show, so that I would be in situ every morning when they did the news bulletins and the sports bulletins, to be aware and to react if there were any news story that broke around about Leeds United in particular, but football in general, the other clubs they covered, Bradford, Huddersfield, Halifax. So that was my initial role with the radio station. And then they also knew that I'd done some commentary already. My very first ever proper commentary on radio was Wrexham against Winsford United in the FA Cup,
right? Okay.
Which was the previous winter, which was 2 games before we ended up playing Arsenal in the very famous FA Cup tie that Wrexham won, possibly the most famous game that Wrexham have ever played in. So I was commentating on that first round in the FA Cup, very pertinent at the moment because we're talking about Wrexham in the FA Cup currently, obviously. I did the second round, and then by the time the third round came on, I'd moved on to another job. But they knew I could commentate, so they brought me in because they were looking to expand the sports department as well. So they said to me, listen, come in and do this job, working on the breakfast show as this sort of hybrid news sports reporter. And when the opportunity arises, we'll get you out there to do some sport, but football in particular, because that was the big thing that they wanted covering. They had a guy called Peter Drury who was there already. Now, people all around the world will know Peter Drury because his commentaries go out all over the place now, specifically in North America as well. And Peter's an old colleague of mine, so he was there working at the station when I arrived there, and he was doing Leeds United at that time. Anyway, basically, to cut a relatively long story short, I sort of had to bide my time and keep doing the job I was doing, but I got spoon-fed little bits of extra football. First match commentary I did for them was actually Halifax v Wrexham at the Shea on a Friday night. a game which I was going to go to as a fan, and then ended up going to commentate on, but for BBC Radio Leeds. So that was from the Halifax perspective. Mm-hmm. So I did that. That was the first game I ever covered for them. And then by the end of that season, I'd been offered my first Leeds United match commentary. Peter had moved on now to bigger and much better things. And I got the opportunity then from the start, actually, as it turned out, the next season. The reason I didn't get that very first commentary at the end of that season, it was Coventry versus Leeds United. Again, Coventry topical in terms of the way we're talking currently. But it was in the Premier League, because it was the first season ever of the Premier League. And I was offered the chance to commentate on Coventry v Leeds United for BBC Radio Leeds. And I turned down the opportunity because I wanted to be at the racecourse to watch Wrexham play Colchester United in the final home game of our promotion season in 1993. And there was a chance still that Wrexham could win the league that day by beating Colchester. So I turned down the opportunity to commentate on a Premier League game, my very first ever Premier League game involving Leeds United, and opted instead to go to the racecourse to watch Wrexham, as it turned out, not win the title. Still get promoted, but not win the title. So I made a choice on that day. Arguably was not the best choice, but it didn't actually count against me too much, because next season I then started doing the Leeds United matches, and I was then commentating on Leeds United every single game, home and away. So I think in the States they call it a game caller, I think they call it a commentator. We call them in this country. And my co-commentator, the expert analysis that I had alongside me was a guy called Norman Hunter. Yes. For those who don't know, he was a very, very famous England international Leeds United footballer. And he became a really good friend, and we worked together week in, week out on all the Leeds United matches all over the country and abroad as well. And we built up a good rapport between ourselves, and that helped in terms of the rapport with the listeners as well. So as a service, we got really good positive feedback from it. And so I did that for 5 years solidly. And then I got the opportunity to go and move on to Sky Sports. So I was working much bigger operation then. But I'd loved the years that I'd done at Leeds United. And it came in really, really handy when 21 years or whatever it was later, I finally left Sky Sports, and Leeds United said, actually, we're looking for a commentator now. So do you fancy doing Leeds United again? So I was in situ. That brings you right up to date effectively, but that's how the Leeds United connection began.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I mean, my memory, I'll tell you, Bryn, my memory, the one thing that sticks in my mind was 2007, and you were at the racecourse, and it was the Boston game, and Jeff Stelling was throwing over to you sort of every 10, 15 minutes, because that was the game that we had. It was basically winner stays up. And I always remember that, where Jeff kept throwing back to you, and you at first it was quite solemn because they went 1-0 up. And they were going to stay up and we were going to go down. And then later on, I just remember you sort of dancing about every time sort of Jeff threw back to you, because we obviously went on to win the game 2-1. Unfortunately for us, that was a little bit of a red flag that season, because the following season we did actually get relegated down to the National League. I think my question for you is, at the point when we got relegated in the following season, how long did you think in your mind at that point we were going to be in non-league football?
Well, it wasn't this long, let's put it that way. It's funny because, look, I'm an old man now, and I wasn't anticipating that was going to be the case when we got relegated. And at the end of that Boston game that you mentioned there, so it was an incredible day. They actually needed to draw Wrexham, Boston needed to win, but they got the win. And I was allowed to be daft on television, and I was like crying with the emotion of it, and they were all just laughing away in the studio, because Soccer Saturday that was going out on is a huge show in the UK, and it's the one that everybody sits down to watch on a match day afternoon, a Saturday afternoon. So it was a really, really popular service at that time. So a lot of people saw all that bit. And at the end of the game, I went down, I had to do the usual post-match interviews and stuff. And I interviewed Brian Carey, who was the manager at the time, a former player, really nice guy, Brian. And I was chatting with him because he knew I was a Wrexham supporter as well as being there to cover the game. And they'd given me carte blanche basically to be a Wrexham fan on telly that day. I'd been told beforehand, kind of do what you feel you're going to do, sort of thing. So it was okay, but I had to keep it within certain, because there were Boston fans watching as well. But so we were chatting at the end of it, and it was kind of the dust was settling and Wrexham had stayed up. And he said to me, the one thing we've got to ensure is that we're not in the same place again next season. And he made that point in conversation. He was quite forthright about that. And as you've suggested, actually what happened was that we were in exactly the same position next season, but worse, because we ended up not getting the results required to stay in the Football League, and we lost away at Hereford. I think that was the final game that it wasn't the final game of the season, but it was the game that confirmed the club's relegation. But what was the norm at that time was that clubs went into the conference, as it was then known, and because they were fully professional outfits, they trained every day, unlike a lot of the other teams in that league at that time. It was expected that the likelihood was that you would come up pretty quickly, if not straight away. You had better fan bases, generally speaking, than all the clubs you were up against. So your budget should have been better than the clubs you were up against. And by the end of the season, the fact that your players trained all the time and lots of the opposition players maybe only trained 2 or 3 times a week, the benefit of that should be shown in terms of your eventual promotion back to the Football League. But as we know, sitting here now, that never became the case. And I think the most depressing fact around that, well, there's a number of depressing facts around it, to be honest. I mean, when I started watching Wrexham was in 1979. My first ever game at the racecourse was in March 1979. I just moved across the border from Liverpool when my dad had got a new job. My mum's a Welsh speaker, so she was like coming back to North Wales for her. But they were very keen to get me along to watch the football because we'd left Liverpool, who had a fantastic football team. They were the European champions at the time, arguably the best club side in the world at the time. And I'd been to watch Liverpool games because my dad was a Liverpool fan, so he'd taken me there. So I'd had this fantastic introduction to football watching, seeing the best side in the world play. And then they were saying to me, well, we're going to a place now, it's got a football team. And I said, yeah, but they're in the 2nd division. And they said, yeah, but that's not too bad, and they might get promoted. So I was being offered what I saw as being substandard footballing fare because Wrexham were 1 division below Liverpool. So the very first game I went to watch at the racecourse was a week or 2 after we'd moved to Rwabon. We were living just out a village just outside of Wrexham. And it was Blackburn Rovers at home. So Blackburn, who are these days, who've been Premier League champions themselves since this happened. In those days, were at 2nd tier level like Wrexham were, as they are now. There was a crowd of just under 10,000 at the racecourse that day for that game. So smaller crowd for that game in the 2nd tier than we're currently getting for home games in the 5th tier. But there was a crowd of 10,000 there. We won. And that was kind of me in then. From that point on, I enjoyed the experience. And I started supporting Wrexham from that point on, March 1979. The next 2 games that I saw at the racecourse after that, one was against Sunderland and one was against Stoke, 2 big clubs with big supports. And Sunderland were trying to get promoted to the top division. They brought thousands of fans with them. There were nearly 20,000 at both those fixtures. At each of the games, there were nearly crowds of just short of 20,000. So I saw from the first 3 games, I saw 10,000 crowd and then 20,000 crowd, 20,000 crowd. Sunderland, Stoke, Blackburn, all big names in the English game. And that was how it was. That's how it was. That's, my expectation was that we would play Newcastle United in the league. We would play Chelsea in the league. We would play West Ham in the league. I've seen us play all these teams in the Football League as our equals, perceived equals at least. And now, for the last 15 years, I've been looking at team names and I think to myself, I know the UK quite well, and I don't know where this place is. Give me a map, and I'm not confident I can point to this place on a map. Asking me where Dorking is, and I'll tell you, I'm not entirely sure where Dorking is. I don't know. I know we play them, but I don't know where it is. And we've been playing teams from places that I'm not quite sure where they are for way too long now. So I'm hoping that time is about to come to an end, but we'll see.
I think we all are.
Definitely. I mean, you're very right there. I remember going to games against in the league as well. Man City, Brentford, Bournemouth, you know, all these teams who are all now Premier League teams. I mean, you look at Man City, all right, they've had a huge amount of investment, but, you know, it wasn't that long ago we were playing them in the league, and you know, and we you know, if you were to look at us now, they're sort of poles apart, really, you know, and it's odd.
Well, the Manchester City were like us; they'd fallen on hard times, and they slid to a level below where they should have been operating at. So that day that we played them at their old stadium at Main Road, I was there. That was my stag day that day. So I was there with all my pals, and we met up in Manchester and had a really good day out. And it started with that game at Main Road, which we drew 0-0, and they played us off the park for 90 minutes. And Mark Cartwright, who was in goal for us, played fantastically well. And we celebrated that 0-0 away point as if it was winning the cup final, because it was at Main Road. There were about 30,000 people there. There were probably 3,500 Wrexham fans there. And it was us playing Manchester City, and it just seemed mad at the time that this would be a league fixture at the third tier level as well. Yeah. Then we played them on Boxing Day, and they won 1-0 at the racecourse. And they hadn't been doing very well up until that point. We played really well against them that day, should have won the game, and they went on and barely lost a game and ended up getting promoted at the end of that season. They were on the move back towards a place that they expected to be, the top division. That was their journey back started there. We haven't hit that point where we haven't got to that point still where this is where your journey back starts. I mean, there's a sense that we're in the midst of that now, but we fell, they fell. They got back up, and they are now, I don't know what they are, the richest club in the world by lucky circumstances perhaps, but then we've enjoyed something similar. We now have to make that same journey that they've made, make the most of this opportunity that's been presented.
Definitely.
So, obviously, Wrexham have had ups and downs and things over the years. But what is your favourite era watching Wrexham?
That's a good question. My favourite era is the one when Brian Flynn was in charge. When we got into the division, the third tier level. This gets complicated for people who don't necessarily. Sean, you might have been struggling with this one to an extent in terms of the terminology here. Because in the old days, we had first division, second division, third division, fourth division. Then it changed to Premier League, Championship. Well, it wasn't initially League One and League Two either. There was another stage before that. No. But now when you talk about, I talk about tiers because it just makes more sense. We have 5 tiers. So we're currently playing at the fifth level, or the fifth tier, if you like. But we got up, I'm confusing myself now. We got up to League One, which is the third tier under Brian Flynn. I'd missed the bit because I moved to Wrexham in 1979. Prior to 1979, Wrexham had been fantastic for a number of years, and this is where a lot of the sort of inherited history and around the football club comes from. That period in the late 60s to the early 1980s, more like really the late 70s, frankly, when the club was constantly on the up and up, got to FA Cup quarterfinals twice, was playing in Europe regularly, got to the quarterfinals of the European Cup Winners' Cup, was playing regularly in front of big crowds, 20,000 type crowds. And that was a fantastic football team. But I missed all that. Timing has never been one of my strong points. So I arrived when the club was at the second tier level, but was actually inexorably beginning the slide down the divisions. And I saw and experienced, witnessed that slide down through the divisions to a position where there were crowds of less than 1,000. I've been in crowds of less than 1,000 for league games, football league games at the racecourse. So where we're at now, much lower than we were then, is remarkable, even on the basis of that fact. So we began a bit of a climb back when Brian Flynn got the job. There's a little tale attached to that. I was an avid fan, obviously, by this point. We played at home against Burnley one weekend. We were in the fourth tier at this stage, and we lost 2-6 at home to Burnley. And after the match, I was so disconsolate, so distraught with this performance, and particularly with the result, that I sat down and wrote a letter to Brian Flynn to say, basically, if you don't think you can handle this, it was his first ever job in management. He'd been a player before. If you don't think you can handle it, you should walk away now. I was about 16 or 17 when I wrote it, and I sent it off. And on, I guess it would have been Monday or Tuesday morning, probably Monday morning, because we had a sort of service that would get their letter delivered, I don't know, through Monday then. Anyway, Monday morning, I was upstairs in bed getting ready just to get up to go to school, and the phone rang downstairs, and my mum answered, and she called up. She said, "There's a phone call for you." I said, "Okay, right." She said, "It's Brian Flynn," and it was Brian Flynn, the manager, who had the letter, who had read the letter, and had then gone and found a telephone number so that he could ring me and explain why actually he was the right guy for the job, and it was, if we were patient, it was all going to be okay. And I thought that was fantastic. I mean, what a touch that was. And I mean, I've got to know Brian really well since then, through my career. And we talk about that. I've talked about that with him since, because that showed his commitment to this thing, that he gave me the time of day. And I was very, very impressed. And not only did he then do that, but he actually did what he said he was going to do in the telephone conversation. And he created and built something, the best thing I've seen up until this point at Wrexham, because what he invested in was the infrastructure, not just the first team. In fact, there wasn't really money to invest in the first team, only sporadically. So what he did was very, very clever. Brilliant scouting, brilliant youth setup that he created at the club. And we reaped the benefits of that for a number of years afterwards. And it was under Brian's leadership that they built Colliers Park Training Ground, the training centre, which was at the time absolutely envy of other clubs in the Football League, because we had better training facilities with that Colliers Park training ground than clubs in a Championship Tier 2 level had. And I was travelling around by now working and seeing what other clubs' facilities were like, and Wrexham's were better, and we were at a lower level than them. And he took us to the brink. There was one game away at Southend. It was the last game of the season, and we were playing to try and get into the top 7, it would be, wouldn't it, in the division. So the third tier, League One as it is now, we were playing to get on the final day. If we won the game, there was a possibility we got into the playoffs out of that division. And in the second half, we were beating Southend. And at the same time we were beating Southend, I think it was Brentford, who were our rivals for that final playoff spot, were losing at Bristol Rovers. And for 5 or 10 fantastic minutes, we were in the playoffs on the final day of the season. And then inevitably, this being Wrexham, their game kind of ran beyond ours. They equalised and then got the winning goal. Whatever happened, anyway, they ended up getting the result that they needed ultimately to secure that final playoff place. So I had 10 minutes where we were almost in the frame to get promoted to the Championship again. And that was with the team that he created. And his skill was in building and rejuvenating. We'd sell players, good players, and we'd sell them for a lot of money. People like Brian Hughes went for a lot of money, but then he would find a way of replacing them. And he brought through loads of lads who are still very close to the club. So that team that beat Arsenal was full of people who'd come through the youth system. And it was built basically on a very local basis. So that was the best period was the entire Brian Flynn period. But the best bit for me within that period, I think, was that spell when we were in at League One level, and we had a team that was competing at the top end of that League One level. We had some really good players, and we got as close as I've seen Wrexham get to getting back to that second tier level at that stage.
So how does the team that we've got now, how does that team, or this team, kind of fare to the team under Brian Flynn?
Well, again, it's interesting because I've seen comparisons made recently about where does Paul Mullin rank as a striker for Wrexham.
Yeah.
And, well, he's really good. But the problem with ranking him against other strikers is that all the people you tend to rank him against were all playing at a higher level.
Yeah.
Because Wrexham, so the players that one of my first Wrexham heroes was Dixie McNeil. So when I arrived in Wrexham, he was the star striker then. And I loved Dixie McNeil as he was a great player, great striker. So in terms of ability and the level we were playing at, second tier level, where he was scoring goals, because of that level, he has to go down as the best striker. There's been other great strikers since. Gary Bennett was fantastic, scored oodles of goals. Andy Morrell was brilliant as well, another great goal scorer. Lee Trundle, fantastically skillful striker, and all playing at the higher level. Mm-hmm. So Paul's done fantastically well for us in terms of the number of goals he's scored, but he's not playing against the quality of opposition that all those guys, frankly, were playing against, because they were playing at the higher level. So it's quite difficult to make comparisons.
Yeah.
What I like at the moment is that, and I think we saw this in the game at Coventry in particular, is that this is a team that can play with a bit of a swagger. And it's been a long time since we've had a team that can do that. The last team that did it was probably Dennis Smith's promotion side. Again, we had some really good players in that. A team who you just felt when they walked out, you were confident, they were as confident as you were that they were going to win the game. And we saw in particular against Coventry, I think, because they were playing a game for the first time in ages. I mean, like years. Wrexham were playing a game which didn't really have any pressure on it, because there was no expectation ahead of that match of anything other than what the Wrexham fans brought with them. But there was no expectation to win the game. And every single game Wrexham have been playing, pretty much ever since they've been in this non-league setup, pretty much every single game they are expected to win. Loads of times it doesn't happen, but every time the expectation's there. So every player we've had in this non-league period has laboured under that pressure of being expected to win every single game, because we're Wrexham. And we haven't really, well, the likes of me, my generation, maybe you're the same as well, still haven't really accepted that we are where we're meant to be, you know, that we've not really got our heads around the fact that this is a non-league football club, despite the fact that I don't think we've been in any division previously in our history as long as we've been in this particular division. So we are clearly a non-league football club. We just don't feel we are. Maybe, Sian, from your perspective as a newer fan, you don't label and you don't have that same kind of that same sense around the thing that we're not where we're meant to be. I don't know. I'm interested how the newer fans, those who've only come to the club in the non-league period, how they perceive stuff. Because we've been to the places like Manchester City, as I mentioned, and Newcastle and places like that, and seen league games as well as cup games against those sorts of opponents. So to go to Coventry was a great day out, but it wasn't the first time I've ever been in those sort of circumstances and surroundings with Wrexham. But what was really encouraging was the way that they approached and played in that game, because finally, when they were able to play without pressure and enjoy the game, they were, for an hour, they were absolutely fantastic. And some of the best football that I've seen Wrexham side play for a long, long time, probably since we were in the Football League, almost certainly since we were in the Football League. So that was an enjoyable aspect of that. There haven't been enough of those, and there won't be many more of them between now and the end of the season either, by the way.
If you had to, so let's take, if you have to take off your aviation gin Wrexham hat and put on your John Motson style sort of commentator, sports journalist hat, take all the emotion out of it, how do you see this season going? If you're just looking at it objectively, I know that's a really hard question because you're a Wrexham fan, but how do you genuinely see the end of the season looking for us?
Well, in fairness, probably my view would be the same. With wearing either hat, my John Motson Trilby or my Ryan Reynolds style baseball cap, which I'd love to see in the club shop, by the way. Why do we not have the chance to buy a Ryan Reynolds crested baseball cap? But that's another matter. I think the season will continue the way the season is my suspicion. You've got three sides, and I have to say three sides because I think Chesterfield are a good team as well. You've got three sides who are measurably better this year than the rest. So we've had in previous seasons, we've had one team that's been standout in terms of their performances. You've had two teams when us and Fleetwood were going at it, and we ended up with 98 points and incredibly still didn't get promoted. Well, we could be heading for a similar scenario to that. In fact, I think we probably are heading for a similar scenario to that this time, because I just don't see, having seen quite a few games actually this season and seen a bit of Notts County as well. And I was at Notts County when we lost there, and I was at Chesterfield when we lost there. They're two decent sides, and I don't think they're going to drop many. I think there's a sense we have as fans now that at some point they're going to hit, that they'll have a blip or whatever. My sense is that probably isn't going to happen. I think it's going to be very fine margins, and it could be like it is now, bearing in mind there's the games in hand scenario currently. It could be like it is now right the way through until the end of the season. I cannot anticipate that of those three teams at the top, that any of them is going to have a major sort of wobble.
No.
There'll be the odd game, and it's going to be based on, I think, the fine margins will be based on a draw here or there that should have been a win. And I suspect that when we come to analyse at the end of the season, that's what we'll be looking back on, reflecting on, well, we either succeeded because of that point that we gained at wherever it was, or we failed because of that equaliser we conceded at York, for instance.
Yes.
I think it'll be that sort of ending this season. I fear, because that means that means a lot of tense games.
It does. I mean, you touched on it there. We've, Notts County have got the points in the bag. We've got the games in hand. I'm sure you agree. We'd rather have the points than the games, but the reason for that is obviously FA Cup, FA Trophy. How do you see cup games? Do you see them as like a complete distraction from the league, or do you think them an important way to keep that sort of winning train running?
But yeah, I've been musing on this actually in the aftermath. We're talking in the relatively recent aftermath of the Coventry game. There are two different examples that you could follow here. Lincoln City, who were a very good conference side and won the league, deservedly won the league, had a fantastic FA Cup run in the same season that they got themselves promoted by winning the league, and went all the way to the whatever it was, quarterfinals or whatever. And so it didn't impact upon their promotion push at all. Trying to remember back who were the teams who were competing with them. It wasn't a league like this league that year, though. I don't think there was the pressure of competition to the same extent at the top end of the table that there is this year, with three teams really going for it. Two in particular, but three for sure. So maybe the circumstances were slightly easier in Lincoln's favour that season. The other example would be Boreham Wood last year, who had a really great FA Cup run. And then we played them off the back of the game at Everton last season. And a team that I was expecting to be, they'd been up there pushing for promotion up until that point. And a team that I was expecting to be kind of right at it when they played against us at the racecourse was actually not great. And we beat them. And they didn't have a very good run from there on to the end of the season, despite drawing with us at Boreham Wood, which turned out to be a bit of a significant setback for us. But they didn't look the same team after the cup run. So with a smaller squad, and the impact that those extra games had on them didn't seem to help. But I think the advantage here is, let's face it, Coventry didn't even beat Wrexham's first team. Didn't even lose to Wrexham's first team.
Yes.
We'd made changes for the game. So we do have a squad with players in it who will take the opportunity to step into the team in these circumstances. So I'm not unduly worried about an FA Cup run. I don't think it'll last much longer anyway. That's the reality.
Yeah.
And I think it puts a lot of money in the coffers, which is not a huge priority, but it does help enhance the sense of what's possible at the football club without external assistance, very valuable and very welcome though it is. We need to prove to people that there's a good thing going here in general anyway. But the one that I think, by the time this goes out, we may know more about this, but I suspect the one that we will be leaping out of potentially is the FA Trophy, because I don't quite see this year that unless that second string team, which is pretty strong, by the way, still, because it's the squad has got depth all the way through it now. The second string kind of team that figures in those sorts of games may well do really well in them, frankly.
Yeah.
But it's not, if we're focusing, we focus on the league, and if we're then sort of hyper focusing, it's on the FA Cup matches, because there won't be too many more of them. Maybe there might be one more. But the trophy game, I think the trophy is a tournament too far this year. It didn't help us last year. I don't think getting to the final was great, probably great for the series, but I don't think it really helped in any sense in terms of what we were doing in the league at the time.
So we've seen you up in the nice posh seats at the racecourse, where Rob and Ryan sit.
We're just below those, actually.
We are just below those. When there was sort of whispers about Rob and Ryan sort of taking over the club, did you get wind of that sort of prior to it coming out in the news, or were you just as shocked as everybody else when that actually came out?
Well, the answer to that in a way is yes and no, because I was in touch, and I am in touch with Jeff Stelling, the Soccer Saturday presenter, who's a big Hartlepool United fan, and Hartlepool have been down at the level we're at and got themselves back up again. I was in conversation with him, or we were exchanging text messages around the fortunes of our respective football clubs at one point, and he mentioned that there'd been a suggestion of a takeover for Hartlepool, and that he'd been told there were two high-value Americans, but he didn't know their identities, who were interested in possibly getting involved with the football club. So I said, well, all right, okay, well, if they're not going to take over at Hartlepool, maybe you could send them over to Wrexham, because we could maybe do with a bit of help. And he said, well, it's funny you say that, because he said, I suspect that they may be doing that now. And I assume that was it has to be the same people. It was in the same time frame. And so at that point, there was, at some stage just after that, the revelation as to the surprise for me was the revelation of the personalities involved. So I was aware that there was interest, perhaps, and I was aware that it was significant and it was American. But when the names were revealed, then that was when things were suddenly completely crazy, frankly. And really remains so to this day. To all intents and purposes, we're still kind of all shaking our heads a little and going, how did this happen? Yeah. We get more of a handle, maybe, or more of a sense of it now, but it still feels almost as mad as it did on that very first day when the names were revealed to us all.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, you've been head of the Wrexham Supporters Trust at one point, and in your opinion, was the timing perfect for someone like people like Ryan and Rob to come in and sort of take that club over to try and drive it forward?
Well, yeah, I mean, I was the president of the Supporters Trust, which was kind of phenomenal. It was a symbolic title position, and I'd actually stepped down from that position because, as I said at the time, I had concerns that I didn't think that we, under that model, could do what needed to be done to take the club forward. And I think I could see signs that we were really beginning to struggle with the day-to-day business of keeping the football club going. But not only, you have to do more than that in football. As Ryan and Rob will testify, they know now, it's not enough to just keep things going. You're not allowed to just keep ticking along. You always have to be seen to be progressive. And to be progressive, that generally means, in the modern parlance, people expect you to be spending money, investing, to push on, get better. And that's the pressure of owning and running a football club. And we were, as a trust, as a fan base, we were finding it tough enough just to keep things going. And the point at which this, the takeover detail emerged was incredibly important, because I'd got to the stage in lockdown. As a fan-owned club, the number one source of revenue is what comes in through the turnstiles. You can make other stuff, but it's always pretty much going to be, unless you've got a fantastic commercial department, and how do you pay for that as a fan-owned club? But it's always generally going to be what comes in through the turnstiles. So at the point you arrive at a situation where there's nothing coming into the turnstiles because you're not allowed to have fans in, you've clearly got a big problem. Yeah. And we were at that point, and we were in the midst of that. And I knew we were finding it hard anyway. And then I could only see bad things ahead, really bad things ahead for the football club at that stage, because it was like, how are we going to keep this thing going with no income at all, with nobody to step in? And there was no directors, but nobody had a financial investment other than what we were all paying in every month. So I was extremely concerned about what the future held at that stage. And then all of a sudden, this gift arrived. So the timing from our perspective as a fan base was unbelievably important, because I'm not sure we'd have had a football club without it. I'll be honest, not even in the format which we're at that time. Never mind where we are now, or hopefully where we're going now. But I was really worried about the future at that stage. The timing from Rob and Ryan's perspective was actually really tricky in many ways because of that, because they came into a club at a time when it was doing no business, but that wasn't the problem, because they brought finance with them. But they couldn't get any sense of what the club was about, because where were the people? they were all out there. They were being kept outside. And the first thing, one of the things that in my career, and I've been doing this 30 years, this sports broadcasting bit, one of the things I'm probably proudest of in that entire time was when I was in touch with the club at this point anyway over some other stuff. And I have a contact with Sean Harvey that goes back lots and lots of years because we've worked together in the past when he's been at other football clubs that I've been covering. And we were talking about some stuff that I might be doing now that the takeover had been confirmed. And at the same time, I said to him, we might be able to help out with the match coverage, with the match streaming. That was the only source of income, frankly, at that point in lockdown. So the club was producing the match stream, fans were paying for it, and there was some income coming in from that. But I didn't think the coverage was very good. There were legitimate reasons as to why that was the case, but I knew that we could do it better because it was something I'd done before for other football clubs. So we had that conversation, and on the same day that I suggested we could improve the match coverage, I was told that if I put a picture and a proposal in as to how we do it, it would go to the owners and we'd get an answer. And by the end of that day, we had an answer, and the answer was go for it. So that was on a Wednesday or a Thursday. By the next Tuesday, I think it was, we were doing our first match stream coverage. And it was incredibly nervy because for me, there was an awful lot riding on it because it was people I knew were all watching it, including my mum, for instance. So, and there was a lot of pressure on that to go well, because that in effect was the owner's first investment in the football club. Because that was them, I think, saying, right, we can immediately have an impact on the quality of the coverage here, and it will require us to spend some money, to invest some money. But if we do that, the fans will get better quality coverage. And that was, again, in its own little tiny way, that was a significant gesture on their part, because it was a recognition that they could help make things better. So we went in and we did the match coverage, and that was something that I would hold up in at any time and say I was as pleased with the way that turned out as anything that I'd done at any other time before, because that was just a little symbol of the club moving forward. That was the improvement that they could help bring about. They'd spotted it and they were prepared to back it, to make it happen. Yeah. So it gave me a sense that we were in good hands here. Right from that was day one. That was the first, on the first day of the official takeover.
So with Ryan and Rob, talking to Ryan and Rob, obviously they've never been, shy in saying that they had no footballing knowledge. Because of that, did you have any concerns with them taking over Wrexham Football Club?
But again, you ask some good questions, Shan. That's good, because that is a good question. Because yes, is the honest answer. Because I've seen in the job that I've had, I've dealt with lots and lots of owners of football clubs, and I usually tend to deal with them in two sets of circumstances: either triumph or the opposite. Devastation, effectively. I've been and covered lots of football clubs who've been in terrible financial straits, including Wrexham down the years. And so I've met a lot of people who own football clubs. I've seen a lot of situations that have been created around the ownership structures at football clubs. And it is a concern of mine that people would come in who had no knowledge, because I've seen that happen before, and it often doesn't end well. What is actually better, though, is to come in and say, I have no knowledge. Yeah. That's better. Yeah. What is really tends to be more of a problem is when people come in and say, I'm a football fan. I know how this thing works. I'm a successful businessman or woman, generally a man. So I'm going to apply the success that I've had in business to football, and this is going to be fantastic. It's going to be much better. And they then think that they can do all the things that have made them successful in business in football, and everything will suddenly be brilliant. And the reality is that football is not an industry like any other, and it doesn't operate like any other industry operates. So they suddenly realize that what they would do in their factory that produces widgets or whatever it might be, if they want to make the factory better, they buy a better piece of equipment, a better piece of machinery. They put that in place. If the machinery breaks down, a guy comes in and he fixes it, and the machine works again, and they carry on producing widgets. You spend £2 million on a new striker. He comes in, he breaks his leg in his first game, and he doesn't play again for 18 months. And you're still paying the investment level. That's where it differs in aspects like that. You've got a customer base that will take an active part in telling you that the product that you're selling them is not up to scratch. They'll shout it in your face. They'll come and find you. They'll protest outside the ground. They'll stand around your car. Those sorts of things will happen in football that will never happen to anybody in a place of work, business in a business sense. So it is not the same at all. So it's actually far better that somebody comes and said, I have no idea. The key bit is to say, I've got no idea, but I'm going to ask people for help.
Yeah.
We are going to, in this instance, we are going to bring in people who will assist us with this. And if we give them the opportunity to do what they can do, then that will help us. And their most important role is asking the right questions at the moment, because they've got people in place who should know the answers. So from Sean Harvey's perspective, Sean has his detractors in the part of the world that I live in, Leeds. Sean, I'm sure he wouldn't mind me saying, is not the most popular person necessarily. That's part of his background. But what he has, and it's quite rare in football, is he has a CV that actually completely underlines the fact that he's worked in football, in the football industry, such as it can be called, for a long, long time. He's had good moments and he's had bad moments. He'll probably be the first to hold his hands up and admit that. But he brings a level of experience. It's actually quite rare in football. Football doesn't cultivate industrial experience in this sense to the same level that perhaps other industries do. So there isn't a ready stock of chief executives or managing directors out there to go and approach to come in to do football clubs, which is why you tend to find the same people doing jobs, moving from club to club to club, because you now understand the industry and you're actually you're a bit of a rarity on that basis. So football has trained up managers and coaches aplenty, but hasn't done the same thing with that side of the business for whatever reason. So it's quite difficult sometimes to find people to do this sort of stuff. So Sean brings a wealth of experience with him. The other people who've come in to work with them have brought experience in with them as well. The manager has great experience, as do his coaching staff. And all these things are significant because then that gives the owners the opportunity to say to them, well, what do you think? And then to listen to what they get told. They've got fantastic experiences of their own in other aspects, which they can apply to this. But they will listen, and that listening, they're not telling, they're not dictating, they're not saying, we think this is what you should do. They're saying, what do you think we should do? And then they'll give a response. And it's actually, I think, a bit of an unusual way to do things in football, believe it or not. But I prefer it that way.
Yeah, well, 100%. I think they've definitely breathed new life into Wrexham, and that just goes to show with the amount of people that we're getting to the games. I mean, I not going back, only going back a couple of years. There was a couple of thousand there, and now we're getting 10,000 week in, week out, and it's so nice to see as well. You can see that growth and you can see that passion back in the town for watching the club again, which is amazing.
It is.
It's January, obviously. Transfer window was open. Do you envisage us bringing anybody? Is there gaps in that squad that you can see that you'd like to see somebody coming in?
There aren't obvious gaps because we do have cover in pretty much every position, but there are areas where we're possibly a little thinner than in other areas. I still have a slight concern that if anything happened to either, was more than a slight concern, a concern that if anything happened to either Mullin or Palmer, then those two guys are leading the way in terms of the number of goals scored. Then you would want somebody, an obvious ready replacement for them. Sam Dolby might be that guy, but there's a potential for maybe still just trying to mitigate the risk there. But it's difficult when you've got an already big squad. How do you attract people to come into it on the basis of the fact, you might get a game rather than you will get a game.
Yeah.
And that makes recruitment in January a little bit trickier potentially, because you're going to have to sell them a vision of the part that they can play in this thing, without actually being able to promise them that they'll get into the team. Because if in ideal circumstances, the team now is the team that kind of finishes at the end of the season, because the team now should be good enough. They certainly should be good enough to stay right in the hunt, you know, and could be good enough to be better even than that. Could be good enough to outright win the league. From what I've seen so far, that's very much my sense. Managers will always want more players, because that's what managers always want.
Yeah.
So the one area that concerns me is a position on the pitch. Well, there's two. There's both fullbacks. We seem to be picking up issues and problems and injuries in the two fullback positions, and I do wonder whether there's a possibility that we might go for another right back, in particular, just on the basis of the fact we might still need cover there. The one thing that will worry everybody within the club is that when we played that final game, the fateful final game against Grimsby at the end of last season, spoiler alert, if you haven't got the end of Welcome to Wrexham, turn off now. But when we lost that game to Grimsby, in the final minutes of that match, we were playing with three central defenders, and only one of them was actually a central defender. That was Ben Tozer.
Yes.
And he was playing alongside Tom O'Connor, and Tyler French was playing as the third centre-back. So we'd run out of centre-backs by the time that key game came round at the end of the season, and the goal was scored off a throw-in into the penalty area that you would have expected somebody like Aaron Hayden to go and deal with.
Yes.
You know, so that one moment, that key crucial moment in the final minute of the final game, was where the squad fell short. So they will not want that situation to arise again. So they could get further recruitment on the basis that anywhere where it looks like there's potential for that to happen, they might go in and get somebody.
Yeah, potentially. You spoke earlier about just to sort of bring it to a nice close. Your favourite ever player I wanted to delve into. Is that Dixie McNeil? You said that was one of your first heroes at Wrexham. Is that your favourite ever player, or is there somebody else who sort of pips into that?
But I've always enjoyed a bit of an anti-hero at football clubs, and down the years there've been quite a few of those.
Yeah.
You won't really have experienced this, Sean, so much, but Wrexham has a reputation as a fan base for always having a favourite worst player. The one player that everybody seemed to pick on, and I was aware of this from very, very early on of watching Wrexham, because the guy who was the butt of it at the time I started watching was Mel Sutton, who was a fantastic midfielder for the football club. Played oodles of games in Europe, because he was at Cardiff City as well, and played in Europe lots of times for Wrexham. But he was always the one that people seemed to be on his back all the time. So there's often been that kind of figure who's cast in almost like the pantomime villain role as far as the Wrexham supporters are concerned. And in those early days of watching Wrexham, there was a lad called Steve Buxton who was a kind of, he broke into the side as they got promoted to the second tier, but he tended to be a sub. But he was like he carried a real reputation with him as being a kind of an angry little guy. He had this big curly in the old days, the big curly. They used to sometimes call it the chicken in the basket curly perm thing. It was a big perm like that. Everybody had them at the time. I didn't have one. I was too young. But all the footballers had them. He had one of those, and it always looked a bit ridiculous as a hairstyle. But Stevie Buxton was one of my kind of anti-hero figures in those early stages. I remember him scoring a couple of goals at least against Cardiff City, and one was a lob over the goalkeeper. And as he ran round the keeper, he jumped into the back of the net and he hung in the back of the net at the Kop end. There was about 3,000 people there. And it was a sort of an iconic image. But I enjoyed him. There was a player called Steve Fox, who when I arrived was a brilliant, tricky winger, who was, I think, a bit of a crazy guy in terms of his lifestyle away from the game. But he was really exciting on his day, fantastic player. And then from that more recent era, the sort of the Brian Flynn era, we had loads of fantastic players who I was very, very fond of at that period. But I think Gary Bennett was right up there at that stage, because he came from Chester, And when he came, he got a load of stick because he was ex-Chester. I mean, I was in games where I was at the game at Bury where I think he scored his first goals for the club away in the cup. And we lost, and he was getting dogs abuse from the Wrexham fans because he used to play for Chester. He scored 2 goals, and he was still getting dogs abuse from the Wrexham fans because he used to play at Chester. And he went on to be absolutely outstanding, obviously. So and there's been a lot of good ones, but he's probably right up there.
Yeah, definitely. One final question for you, Bryn. I'm going to throw a scenario at you. So next round of the FA Cup, let's say Leeds beat Cardiff in their replay and they go through in the next round. Wrexham beat Sheffield United and they meet in the next round. So Leeds are playing Wrexham in the next round of the FA Cup. What would that be like for you to commentate on a game like that? Obviously, you've got huge love for one club. You've got a huge affiliation with another club where you're commentating. What would that be like for you to be commentating on that game?
So we've beaten Sheffield United, and Leeds United have somehow got through an FA Cup third round tie, which they haven't done for 5 years now. And then they've got through against Boreham Wood or Accrington away. Again, neither of those would be a stick-on scenario. So we've got through all of that, and we've ended up finally with what would be, by the way, the first ever competitive meeting between Leeds United and Wrexham. They have never played. They played once in a pre-season friendly in the 60s, I think it was. They have never played each other, which is incredible. And I get paid by Leeds United to commentate on their matches. And on the basis of that, there's an expectation that the commentary is heavily weighted in favour of my employers, Leeds United, and I've got to do a commentary on the Wrexham game. It's probably the hardest question I could get asked, that one, to be honest with you. I mean, I'd give it a go, but I can't guarantee that anybody's going to end up happy at the end of it. I think I would be effectively in a lose-lose situation there. So they might on that particular day, the club might actually pay me to stay away.
Possibly.
Tell me not to ruin the coverage.
Bryn, it has been an absolute pleasure, and I just want to, from both of us, we just want to thank you so much for agreeing to do this. It's been a joy, and to be honest, we could talk to you for another 4 hours, to be honest, but we're not sure we could squeeze that into a podcast if it was 4 hours long.
Or a documentary or something like that.
Yeah, maybe a 4-parter
series.
Thank you so much for doing it. It's been lovely to speak to you, and we'd love to do it again at some point in the future. That'd be great.
No worries. Keep up the good work.
Yes, thank you very much.
So I think everyone will agree that Bryn Law is an absolute legend.
And a true gentleman.
Absolutely true gentleman.
Forever grateful to him for doing that. Thank you very much, Bryn. We've got a few more interviews lined up, so keep your eyes peeled and your ears peeled and everything peeled for them coming very, very soon.
It's exciting.
Yeah, very exciting indeed.
So that's it for us this week. So thank you very much for tuning in, and we shall see you next week.
Bye.